All right. So how are you doing? How's it going?
Well,
Great.
Has anyone started settling into a more regular practice or using it more regularly? It's okay if you're not.
I have.
Do you notice that you're using it more here? So formal practices could take a long time, but do you notice that you're catching yourself a little bit more before you're being reactive or feel entangled by stressors?
I could say that I'm not a flip out person.
You're not a-
I don't react like yell or anything. I just take 5 seconds and say it's not worth it. it's gonna get better.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you wait till the last minute, it only takes a minute. You know, everything always gets done. Everything gets finished, ready to go crazy or not go crazy. That's the kind of person I am.
Right.
Which is good.
Right.
sometimes.
So sometimes like just reframing language is helpful, right? So sometimes these internal things that we tell ourselves can be very supportive, or they could set us up for other things hitting harder, right? So for instance, when you said it's going to get better, maybe just saying it'll change, right? Because then you're open to it possibly not getting better. Right? So it just so these little tricks could be really powerful over time. So just kind of being open to whatever the outcome is, it's going to change from what it is right now. That's a fact. So this kind of trusting in the impermanence of all of it, the good and the bad, could really be a game changer there, you know. Additionally, just as, you know, you guys are a team, you work together, but you're very intimate, right? Like you're always here together, and it's a small team. So you could almost start having these like sibling relationships where just little things will start getting on your nerves, right? Or you know how to trigger each other
we can finish each
by just different things,
sentences.
right? But also, it could make difficult conversations more challenging. So what if we start reframing good, supportive conversations in a different way? So for instance, if there's a party or project you're working on and it turns out really, really well, right? And you make the most delicious cookies and everyone here is commenting about how special they were for this particular event, okay? If Robert was going to say to you, you're awesome, you know, this is awesome, not this is awesome, you're awesome because you did such a good job with this and I'm so happy with you and this and that. Anything you criticize her with, because you put that adjective on her as a person instead of the project or cookie, you could say those cookies were awesome, and this is stuff you may already be doing but not recognizing. It just reframes any more difficult conversations because the person who's taking either the criticism or the honor needs to be shifted out of that being who they are rather than their work being credited or critiqued. So if we're always looking at the work and separating ourselves from the work because the work isn't us, right? The cookies aren't you, right?
But she puts her heart and soul in it.
Of course she does.
We all do.
Right. You do, but it's still separate.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have a new dish that you're going to try and it's a disaster,
Oh yeah, fish cannolis. Been there.
Right. Right.
Terrible. Exactly.
So wouldn't it be easier to have a conversation with Robert that says, yeah, this dish didn't turn out well,
Yeah.
instead of I suck,
Oh yeah.
right?
Oh yeah. There's always
So it's just
separation.
separating it, and we could implement those strategies with our kids, with our partners, with our family, especially, right? Those are interesting and often challenging dynamics. So when we just, you know, your child comes home with their grades and they have a paper, or maybe they're getting a paper ready to turn in, and they say, Mom or Dad, will you take a look at this? And you could say, well, the paper's great. I'm really proud of the work that you put into this, right? Then when they come to you another time and the paper's not great, that it needs more work, the criticism's on the paper and they don't take it so personally. So it just creates a little separateness. So that's just some of the things. But the reason I bring this up is because these same strategies are important to implement internally. So when we start noticing like, oh, I suck because this sucked, right? We could, no, I don't suck. The work I put out sucked. Why? Like why could that have happened, for instance? Right? What did you say? I heard you. I heard you. So it's a little bit of a segue, but I liked your feedback. I appreciate it. Anyone else with any feedback or even your challenges? It's helpful because I guarantee if you have something coming up for you, it's coming up for somebody else in the room. So feel free to share if anyone's challenged with it. Okay. All right. So we're going to start out. I wanted to read you just the story. Do you all know what a lotus flower is? Yeah? Have you ever seen one? You've seen them here probably at the club even.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
Longwood Gardens.
Where?
Longwood Gardens.
Has them?
Just saw them this year. Yeah,
They're beautiful. Beautiful. And did you ever notice how pure they look? Like they don't look ever dirty or, you know, they're just always bright and kind of glistening. But do you know where they grow? In the water. But
lily pads, right?
no. And deep in the water. And they grow in the muck, in the mud. And without the mud, they can't rise to the surface. So that's where they get all of their nutrients in the muck. And when they're grown fully, they come through the muck and they rise up into the water. And when they open, those outer petals dissolve all of the damage or dirt that was remaining from the muck of their existence. And then they open up and there's this just beautiful glistening flower open to the sky, to the sun, to the light. And the lotus flower you'll see in a lot of traditional Eastern artistry. Some of you may be tattooed with the lotus flower, right? And many times those that really know the story of the lotus flower, they can relate, right? Because so often we rise up from the muck of life and we do glisten into the sun. That's where so many lessons are learned, in the muck. That's where we develop this beauty, really, of living. So I wanted to read you a little bit more about the lotus flower and start there. So the lotus flower is a beautiful flower that can be found all over the world, but the start of this flower is not as beautiful as one might have imagined. It's unlike many other flowers. When the lotus first begins to sprout, it is underwater, making its home in lakes and ponds, in areas where the water remains fairly still on the surface. But underneath the surface, the lotus is surrounded by mud and muck and by fish, insects, and dirt, rough conditions. Each beautiful, I feel like I lost something. I'm missing a page. Let's see. The lotus flower, so basically what it's missing is once the flower rises to the surface, was what I just told you, the petals just peel back so that the beauty of the flower can be exposed. And it says, as it basks in the worldly beauty surrounding it, the lotus flower is ready to take on the world. Despite being born into dark, murky conditions, where hope for such beautiful life seems dubious, the lotus grows, rises above adversity. And ironically, this same dirty water washes it clean as it surfaces. As the lotus opens each petal to the air, not a stain or spot of mud remains externally. The inner lotus, too, has never seen a drop of mud or dirty water. It is just pure, bright, and beautiful. In Buddhism, the bud of the lotus symbolizes potential. The lotus flower represents an awakening, spiritual growth, and enlightenment. Just as the lotus flower emerges from the water clean, the lotus also represents purity of the body, speech, and mind. The lotus could be thought of as an awakened mind, which grows naturally towards the warmth and light of truth, love, and compassion. The lotus may appear fragile on the surface, but it is flexible and strong, sturdy, anchored under the surface of the water. You don't need to be a Buddhist to understand that we are all like the lotus flower. Many of us live in that murky water and never make it to the surface so we could blossom. Many of us are closed. We are just buds, ready and eager to feel the sunshine of life on our skin. No matter which stage of life you are in, I'm sure you could relate to the lotus and see yourself in this story. The conditions that produce beautiful life are not always ideal, but that never stops the lotus from rising through adversity, opening its petals and blossoming in the sun. So, and then this is a quote by Goldie Hawn, who I love because she's just so lighthearted, right? The lotus is the most beautiful flower whose petals open one by one, but it will only grow in the mud. In order to grow and gain wisdom, first you must have the mud, the obstacles of life and its suffering. The mud speaks of the common ground that humans share, no matter what our stations in life. Whether we have it all or we have nothing, we are all faced with the same obstacles: sadness, loss, illness, dying, and death. If we are to strive as human beings to gain more wisdom, more kindness, and more compassion, we must have the intention to grow as a lotus and open each petal one by one. So, next time you see a lotus, or every time you see a lotus, maybe pause and just consider any of the muck of life that you're in and how that could be so transformative. Just see it as an opportunity. Do you guys know who Trevor Noah is? Right? He's, what is he, the late night or?
He's from South Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, he's from
Yeah,
South
that's
Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Daily show.
The Daily Show, you're right. He took over for Jon Stewart, I
Yeah.
think. He was born in South Africa, and he was born during the apartheid to a black mother and a white father. So his birth was considered a crime. And the mother was very wise, and she was a very good woman, and he speaks of her quite often. But he wrote a book called Born a Crime, because he knew from as a very young child that this was a fact, but his mother taught him how to see that as an opportunity. And he said at a very young age, he was encouraged to see that every obstacle that was placed before him as an opportunity to go in the right direction. So he never saw anything that came up as stopping him. He just saw it as turning him around. And he speaks of this quite often, and it's a beautiful book. And I don't know about you, but I always root for the underdog, because I relate to that. So it's so important to understand that we're all having this human connection and experience that so often is rooted in the muck of life. right? And we could rise above. And I believe wholeheartedly that these practices support us in those transitions. Any transition, really. It's just important to pay attention to without attaching to it as it being permanent. So in the teachings, we're reminded that anytime we feel that we're permanent, a situation is permanent, a relationship is permanent, there will be suffering. So just to open to change, right? Anytime we feel ourselves rigid, whether that's physically, emotionally, the rigidity of the heart when we close down, or the mind, when the mind gets rigid, there's suffering. Just a reminder to stay open. And lastly, whenever we feel independent, alone, disconnected, it's a reminder there will be suffering. It's a reminder that we are very much dependent. And our health and viability depends on connection with each other, right? So whenever we cut off and separate, in other words, or whenever we are separated from a group or our families or friends, right? That causes suffering. And we can reframe this too, because it then helps us think about empathy and compassion differently. So how is my separateness as a choice creating suffering for other? How is my rigid stance on a particular subject creating suffering for people, right? How can I see myself as impermanent? And how does that reframe everything in relationship? And we had this incredible reminder of preciousness and impermanence with the loss of Kobe Bryant just a few days ago, right? And it was just such shock. I mean, my husband's a big basketball fan, so he saw the news first, and I could tell that he was so. Kobe Bryant grew up in Marion County, so Ed played basketball in high school, and Hazelton, we were a big basketball community, especially in the early '90s when we were winning, right? So of course Ed had friends that he saw Kobe play as a teenager and then followed him into college and so on and so forth. So, but the point I'm trying to make is it didn't matter if you were a fan, a super fan, or just kind of knew the importance of him as an athlete, which is where I was coming from, right? So I'd never saw him play, didn't really follow him, don't really care about athletes, but the impact of that, the suffering and the tragedy of that loss, not just for him, of course, but all of the other souls on board, especially the young teenagers, right? It just made you kind of stop in your track. And I saw this article on Facebook this morning, and I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, and it was so beautiful because we live in such a polarized world right now, where you have to be on a side, and we're in an election year, which is really, has everybody feeling that separateness. And it was speaking to this, and the article said, yet, yes, this is all true, yet, on Sunday, we all felt the impact of that loss. It was like one of those moments, like when JFK Jr. crashed, or Princess Diana, right, where you just pause. And you're reminded of how precious and how quickly life can change in just an instant, right? So these reminders, these mind changings of the practice, which we've talked about here and there, are extremely important to anchor in because we know they're true. And they're very powerful. That's why they're called the mind changings of the practice, because they root us down in this truth that nobody can deny. We can't escape it. And so it kind of sets a fire under you, like this sense of urgency to live and not to miss it, right? Not to get caught up in the muck of it. We're going to come in and out of the muck a lot. Okay? But when we're in the suffering of life, can we still be present to it? Right? We don't necessarily have to push it down. We could open. Like, oh, it's right here. Here it is. And I'm in it, and it sucks. But I could still smile at my child or hug my spouse or, right? These qualities that rise up through the practices and through this commitment of truth and the willingness to turn towards it, they're called what are they called? They're called the six perfections traditionally. And these six perfections are just qualities of being human that are really, really beautiful. And compassion, of course, is embedded there. And it's a quality that we could train up, because often we feel disconnected from compassion. So part of today's lesson is to understand the difference and understand that we have access to these qualities even when we feel like we've turned away from them. So we're going to look directly at empathy and compassion today for others, because we looked at that self-compassion and that loving quality towards ourselves last week or a couple weeks ago. Okay? And that's where it has to start, because otherwise we don't have any practice. If we can't be kind to ourselves, if we can't become a friend to ourselves, a loving friend, right? If we can't just care when we're in the glory of life and when we're in the muck of life, then we lose touch with other. So it has to start with self-compassion, and you may need to take some time there, right? And that's why this is called a practice. We can't perfect these qualities overnight, in other words. But we could kind of start trusting that it's a possibility. And that's the hope, that you leave here today understanding that there's a possibility that I could open to this, that I could feel more connected perhaps, even in my most difficult relationships. Okay? And out of this quality of compassion comes things like tolerance, right? And forgiveness, less judgment, less blame. Okay? So they're important. That's important. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to die today holding a grudge or knowing that somebody hates me. Right? So how can I kind of purify things and be ready for whatever's to come? And it's an intentional living, really. So what is empathy? How would you define it? I'm just curious. Like your ideas on it.
They always say walk a mile in somebody's shoes before you judge.
Yeah,
I'll appreciate it.
right.
How you treat someone.
Yep. That's beautiful. What else? When do we know we're feeling empathy? How does it feel in the body? See if you could bring your mind's eye to an example.
Sadness?
You could describe it that way. I'd be curious to see what was underneath.
Just relating to another
Yeah,
person saying
relating.
It's like,
Relating. That you hit it on the head, right? Yeah. And that naturally kind of opens. What does it physically feel like, though?
Heavy.
Heavy. The quivering of the heart is how it's often described, right? Can you turn towards that quivering of the heart? Empathy is the gateway in, right? And we might not know we're being pulled in. It might just come up, right? We might just be confronted with it. There's a fella that I always see walking around. I saw him on the way here today. And he's got a disability. And he's an older guy, really handsome. And he's got his leg in a brace. And
Does he walk funny?
yeah, the backpack. He always has a backpack.
Yeah.
And every time I see him, I'm just like, it's got to be hard.
But he keeps
Yeah,
moving every
but he
day.
keeps going. And so there's empathy and then also just this admiration. I admire him for his courage. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I don't want to miss out on moments like that. And being awake, it doesn't have to be this mystical kind of, like, demystify it. Right? The word enlightenment is a tough word to swallow. I don't consider myself enlightened for sure. Because I still get caught up all the time. All right? But if we could reframe that word as just being awake and noticing life happening and the beauty of it, and even in the suffering, I could find some beauty there, right? So we could recognize that there could be suffering. These people are suffering, and yet there's also beauty. Often, there's also beauty, right? So it's staying open. Now, what empathy can lead to compassion. What does that mean? What does compassion mean? It's hard, right? When you try to separate the two. What's the difference? There's a difference between the two.
One's feeling, one's acting, isn't it?
Yes.
So if you feel the empathy and your compassion shows.
Compassion is action.
Action.
It's empathy in action. It's extending a hand, the willingness to help, right? When suffering's in front of us, when we're confronted with it. Can you have compassion without empathy?
Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you have empathy without compassion?
Of course.
Probably. Harder to see though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was getting really hard on myself a few months back because I was struggling with a personal relationship and I didn't feel compassionate towards the person. I didn't want to help them at all. And I was, and there was suffering happening. And I just I just kept digging into it and trying to figure it out. And I was practicing a lot of self-compassion because I was getting really hard on myself. Like, this is your work. Like, this is my work that I do every day. How could I not open to that? And I kept sitting with it and I kept trying to get curious about it. And it took a while. Like, it took a couple months for me to figure out that I was able to hold great empathy, but I did not have any compassion for a lot of reasons. And it was okay. And it didn't necessarily mean that my heart wasn't open. In other words, having a big, open, wide heart full of empathy and compassion doesn't mean you become a doormat. It doesn't make you weak. In fact, it makes you very clear in setting boundaries for yourself, healthy, safe boundaries. So we don't have to jump in. So in other words, if there's relationships in your life, and we all have these people who continue to take advantage of that open-heartedness, right? And then you kind of walk away from the situation feeling like, ugh, right? Like, why did that happen again? Right? We have to protect ourselves. And these practices don't make us weak. In fact, just the opposite is true. They make us very, very resilient and strong. And we could get really clear on how we're moving around in our lives and the decisions that we're making and why. So if something's coming up for you and you're like turning away from it, don't get hard on yourself. Look deeper. Find out why. Why is this coming up for me? Can I be with this? And if the answer is no, take another look and keep questioning and get curious, and the answers will come. Or seek out some support of a teacher or help, right? So we're going to do a little exercise today. We're going to break into some small groups. 2. Do we have enough? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Perfect. So this is Vipassana out loud, insight out loud. And it'll be very supportive for you to just kind of realize that you're doing the practice right. Okay, so all the questions are, so we're going to break into small groups and we're going to take 10 minutes to do this exercise. Okay, you'll have 5 minutes each. So the one of you will be meditating for 5 minutes, and the other person will just be holding inquiry or space for inquiry. And all you're going to say, so I'm going to use you guys as an example, all right? You'll go first, and all you're going to say as she's meditating, you'll give her a minute to kind of settle in, and you'll say, what's happening right now? Right? And she'll answer, and she may say, well, I've noticed my right shoulder. It could be something physical. Or thoughts are arising. You don't have to share the thoughts. Or feeling. Right? You can name it if you want. You don't have to. You could just say feeling or remembering or hearing. Just very generic. And then once she answers you, you'll look back at her and say, can you be with that? Can you be with it? Right? And then she'll reveal her truth, yes or no. Right? And then pause. So you may have 3 inquiries within 5 minutes, maybe 2. It's not going to be many. You don't have to share any details about your experience. It's just very generic words. Okay? If nothing's happening, if you fall into a space of a pause in the meditation where things are just still and spacious and kind of free, you could just name that as spaciousness or calm or nothing. And then you'll still ask, can you be with that? Yes or no? Okay? You ready? All right, so can we spread out just a little? Is there any space besides this room that we could spread out to? All right, we're waiting on one more group to come back. I think they were almost done when I saw them. Yeah. How are we with time?
It's close.
It's close.
Yeah, it's
Okay. All right.
5 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Everything we did today is just reframing, right? And considering that we have a lot of power over our thoughts. And we could almost separate from the thoughts. So we could see what's coming into view and what's coming out of view. And we could kind of watch everything come up, whether it's thoughts or, thank you, whether it's thoughts or ideas or stories or feelings or emotions or memories or whatever's coming up, we could just experience them coming up. And when we start to create a little more space between whatever's coming up and consciousness, watching it, it softens, whatever it is. Whether it's physical pain, discomfort, or emotional pain or discomfort, or mental pain or discomfort. Whatever it is, the more space that's there. So if consciousness and the mind are back to back, right? Imagine they're back to back. Then the consciousness can't see it. The mind trying to control things. But with meditation, we're just creating some space so that the mind could kind of soften and settle a little bit. And then when the thoughts come in, this bigger self, whatever we want to call it, awareness, consciousness, the soul, whatever it is, I don't know what it is. But I know I could watch my mind because of the practices. And I know when the mind's more spacious, the hard thoughts or sensations or feelings are softened or softer, and I could be with them in a healthier way. And that's what this was about. Right? So now whatever comes up, however long it stays, am I willing to turn towards it with curiosity? So back to the RAIN acronym, recognizing is about creating that spaciousness there. Right? It's being able to see clearly. Allowing it to be here. Okay, there it is. I'm going to try to be with it. The truth of it. Investigating, getting curious about it. Can I be with this? That's the curiosity. I wonder, can I? Right? The answer to that question, when you ask it to yourself, is the truth of the matter. If the answer is no, consider asking why. Why can't I be with this? And consider that you won't get an answer right away. Just like my example. Why can't I be compassionate in this situation? I didn't know for a while. I had to keep coming back to it whenever it rose up, right? And then the N is that nurturing and non-attachment. This thought isn't me. This inability to be, not be compassionate in this sense is not me. This work is not me, right? All of these things we talked about. This muck of life is not me. I'm not going to identify with the muck. It's here, and I'm in it, and I feel it, and it doesn't mean it's going to go away, but it's not me. Okay? So when we're dealing with the big stuff that comes up, injury, illness, death, sickness, betrayal, it's a shame, right? We could learn to be with that too. And that's where the freedom is. That's where it resides. And that willingness to be with whatever's arising up, the truth of it. Clear seeing. That's what clear seeing is. Okay? So that was all we have for you today. What questions do you have? So hopefully thought-provoking. I always wonder, I'm not sure if, sometimes I wonder if I destabilized you guys completely, or if you're just, in thought, deep in thought. So as always, I'm here and available if you have questions or need extra support, or, I'm going to probably be here a lot next week with this crazy party happening, so just grab me. And I see you again next Wednesday. Next Wednesday is our last session. It's mindfulness of mind, and it'll kind of bring everything we've talked about together. Hopefully it'll start clicking, right? It would be great if we could have a little extra time as a buffer, just in case.
Sure.
And I think that's it for now. Okay, if you want to come ask me questions one-on-one, I'm going to hang out for a few minutes, but otherwise I will see you guys next week.
Thank
Feel
you.
free to take the extra cards too if you want to hand them out to anyone here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.